Welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, September 18th. My name is Pam, and let's just get started. U.S. military draws a line. No more biased against pregnant soldiers by Anna Maureen Grobe. One day, shortly after Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Ruttenberg went back to work as an Air Force pilot following the birth of her first child in 2011, the controls on her jet started malfunctioning, an in-flight emergency. Unable to safely land, I had to go up really high and start troubleshooting for hours. As the flight commander, she was well trained to solve complex problems in the air. What was new was that back at home, she was breastfeeding and needed to pump regularly during the workday, an exigency she skipped during that flight. Ultimately, she touched down safely, and as I relaxed, the milk just started flowing out of me, drenching the front of her flight suit, she says. There were emergency responders, as well as the squadron commander, standing by on the flight line to meet her. Luckily, I had a flight jacket on. She zipped it up, greeted her colleagues, finished some paperwork in the office, and went home. The incidents could have convinced her to embrace formula. Instead, she realized it was important to be more unapologetic about the requirements of breastfeeding. Even women that don't have a job with four walls and a predictable schedule need to make their physiological needs a priority, she said. Had I communicated better with my crew and been more directive, instead of worrying about the stigma that comes along with lactation breaks, I would have pumped before walking out onto the aircraft. Moving forward, that's what Colonel Ruttenberg did. She pumped on the aircraft as well when she needed to. In the years since, the Pentagon has acknowledged the call to make life more equitable for pregnant service members. In 2016, for example, 5 years after Colonel Ruttenberg had her first child, the Defense Department mandated that the military create lactation spaces for women. Major step towards equality. 1 year ago, the Air Force updated a policy for remotely piloted air crews expecting babies. Previously restricted from flying drones, they can now continue to work without a special medical waiver. It was only this month, however, that the Department of Defense banned discrimination against pregnant service members outright, a major step towards equality for women in the armed forces, advocates say. A report last year from the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Service, or the DACOWITS, had sounded the alarm against the continued persistence of negative attitudes toward pregnancy and pregnant service women in the military, and warned that these troops often experience negative impacts on their career. A study released in May from the U.S. Government Accountability Office bears this out, concluding that pregnancy is one of the top reasons enlisted women leave the service. Now that the policy leap has come to pass, the question moving forward, advocates add, is how to advance the culture so that military women and men can transform the workplace for the better. I'm cautiously optimistic that this ban on discrimination means that those in senior positions are paying attention to the work of DACOWITS into things that aren't working very well for women, for families, says Kayla Williams, director of the Military Veterans and Society program at the Center for a New American Security. That said, she adds, as in so many policy changes, the devil is in the implementation. Local commands need to take it seriously. They didn't even ask me. One Air Force lieutenant colonel, who didn't want to be identified because of the potential impact on her career, says she found that her commanders were not ill-intentioned. Quite the opposite, in fact. They were often kindly solicitous, and that's where the problem started. When she became pregnant, she applied for and received a waiver to be in the cockpit during her second trimester. Her boss, however, refused to let her fly. His wife had a difficult pregnancy, and he was protecting me. He's a great guy, but he kind of removed my choice there, right? I wanted to fly, I wanted to contribute, but he took my choice away. A 2020 PhD study from Major Carrie Balser, who works in the Air Force's Plan and Programs Office, found that removing pregnant women from the workplace, even if well-intentioned, will have negative impacts on their military careers. The Air Force officer had been voted by her unit as the #1 person they'd like to go to war with, a notable nod in a male-dominated squadron. She was told she was next in line for an instructor pilot upgrade, an important step in her career. But when her commanders found out she was pregnant, they took her off the list. They didn't even ask me, she says. After she had the second child, she asked for the upgrade again. I said, here's my mitigation plan. I have an on-call nanny. My husband and I share the load 50-50. Their response? A mom needs to be with her baby. You should take more time to recuperate. My supervisor told me, my wife didn't think straight for a year after she had a baby. Ultimately, she decided to leave active duty and is now flying planes for a major airline while continuing to serve as a reservist. And when she learned she was pregnant with her third child, she saw some considerable differences in how her workplaces handled the news. The major airline congratulated her and told her they would make sure she didn't have any routes that flew through zones with outbreaks of the Zika virus. In her reserve job, meanwhile, she had been asked to be director of operations for her unit. After learning of her pregnancy, her supervisor continued to support her for the job, but his boss did not. He said, I'm a hard no against her getting this job. Oh, I'm not against her getting this job because she's going to take so much time off for maternity leave. My squadron commander, to his credit, was like, I don't think you can say that. Up until this month he could, but not anymore. If that had happened today, I would have been able to say, this is discrimination. Colonel Ruttenberg now serves on the Air Force's Women's Initiative team at the Pentagon, where she is heartened by the strides the service has made in requiring lactation spaces and time to pump. She has considered leaving the service too, to take a civilian job with better pay and more family time, she says. But I feel a duty to make the Air Force stronger before I leave. That made me thinking more creatively to meet the challenges female troops face. The Coast Guard sets a great example, Colonel Ruttenberg says, by paying to ship breast milk home when the members is at a temporary duty location. Bases could buy portable lactation pods for non-traditional workspaces, like on the flight line. She says, public health troops could also do something as simple as track lactation spaces on bases and give the list to pregnant service members. Colonel Ruttenberg thinks back to the early chats that she had with her bosses about breastfeeding. I was super uncomfortable, a little insecure, and a little emotional about it, she said. But those feelings also brought to mind the challenges, embarrassments, and triumphs of the military women who paved the way for her and for her female colleagues, she says, citing the Maya Angelou quote that each time a woman stands up for herself, she stands up for all women. That's what I'm trying to get at. By being brave enough to have an awkward conversation, you're normalizing this conversation, she says. You made it 10 times easier for the woman coming behind you. Well, let's move on to our next article. Untethered by the pandemic, urban workers consider a pastoral life, by Sarah Miller Lana. In Hilliard, Ontario, now that Christine Demetris has moved from Toronto to Prince Edward County, an island on the northern shore of Lake Ontario known as the County, she heads to fresh produce stands when she needs groceries, not cramped supermarkets. When she needs fresh air, instead of contemplating the risks of entering an elevator, she walks to her screened-in back porch, which looks out on an acre of land. It's depressing in Toronto, to be honest with you, especially in an apartment. It's confining with the COVID, she said. There's something about getting up in the morning and just hearing the birds or seeing an opossum going by. She says she wasn't a nature person before the pandemic, but since the move in May, her priorities have shifted, and she is not alone. The allure of the city has long been debated, beginning centuries ago with plague outbreaks, through the invention of the car, the internet, and the first notions of remote work and 9/11, but never has an event touched so many people, essentially the entire world, or untethered so many from workplaces like the 2020 pandemic has. A tidal wave of interest. Richard Florida, an urban studies theorist at the University of Toronto, says he sees no evidence of an urban exodus, but he says the pandemic has given way to a massive unmooring for those who can now work from home and a recalibration of values around home life. I've never heard so many people asking, should they move? Where should they move? People all over the world are asking these questions. Where do I live? Do I move to the country? Do I buy a single family home? Do I get a place with a balcony? He says people are really thinking about how they want to live. Dr. Florida says downtown cores of high rise offices and generic suburbs outside cities could suffer. Pastoral settings, particularly those like Prince Edward County, with proximity to urban centers, he says, will do wonderfully well. Dotted with farms and vineyards, the county and its rural chic vibe has for years been attracting urbanites who have come for more space, more leisurely pace, a cheaper housing. But the pandemic has intensified migration, says Treat Hall, a real estate broker with Treat Hall and Associates. He says home sales have doubled in July compared with the same month last year. I think I can only call it an explosion, he says. From our standpoint, for our tiny little community, it's a tidal wave of interest. Many buyers are escaping the city temporarily, he says, and that's a reflex that dates back centuries. Ewan Roger, principal records specialist at the National Archives in the United Kingdom, has written about social distancing measures during 16th century plague outbreaks. He points to a letter from 1532 to Thomas Cromwell in their State Papers collection that noted, "I have not seen London so destitute of people as it was when I came there." But there are modern forces at play that could lead to more permanent migration patterns, including the largest transfer to remote work in history. E-commerce company Shopify was the first major Canadian company to announce it was moving to a work-at-home model, consolidating the trend and freeing employees to live essentially anywhere. Coronavirus has led to probably the greatest experiment of using technology remotely to facilitate work than we've ever seen, says Shauna Braille, an associate professor at the Institute for Management and Innovation at the University of Toronto. Will it last? Steve Ferguson, the mayor of Prince Edward County, says the island will be the beneficiary of this, given its proximity to Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa. He personally knows two friends from Toronto relocating here this fall. Having moved himself 30 years ago, his mantra is that everyone is welcome, he says, then adds, but please respect the reasons that brought you here. Tensions have grown, particularly as tourism swelled this summer. Beaches were so overcrowded that the provincial parks sometimes closed down by mid-morning. More important for locals, housing prices have increased too, on average by about 15% per year over the past 5 years, says Mr. Hall. This year, they are up 25% from last year. David Banks, founder of Old Salt Cocktails, a food truck, moved to Prince Edward County from Toronto in 2016 to set up his business. It has boomed as he sets up in the back field of a winery where lunchtime patrons munch on gourmet sausage creations as chickens roam. But as he watched a steady stream of city dwellers follow his earlier path, he wonders about the nature of the place and worries about his employees, most of whom can't afford the housing costs. Yet Dr. Braille said what appears to be a permanent value shift might prove an illusion. You might get to have your coffee by the lake every morning, but do you have access to the same kinds of other specialized services that you might appreciate, or the cultural amenities, she says? And I'm not convinced that all of the companies, especially the tech companies that have indicated they're going to go digital by default, are going to remain in that mode when this is over. There's going to be a huge pullback to the city, she predicts. Miss Demetris, a retired teacher, doesn't expect to be drawn back, except to visit her children and parents. She worried initially about turning her getaway cottage into a permanent home. Initially, I thought, I can't live out here. Like, what am I going to do here? But even as a winter nears, she has embraced a new lifestyle. It has a name over the social media. #CottageCore. That feels slower and kinder. It's really just a mind shift for me just to move over here. Well, our next article is titled, In a Reversal, Big Ten Restores the Fall Football Season. The Big Ten initially postponed its football season to the spring because of the coronavirus. Now, after weeks of meetings, a lawsuit, and pressure from fans, players, and politicians, it will kick off a fall season. By Ralph D. Russo, Associated Press. The Big Ten is going to give fall football a shot after all. Less than 5 weeks after pushing football and other fall sports to the spring in the name of player safety during the pandemic, the conference changed course Wednesday and said it plans to begin its season the weekend of October 23 and 24. Each team will play 8 games in 8 weeks, and the conference championship game will be held December 19th, if all goes well. That should give the Big Ten an opportunity to compete for the national championship. The Big Ten says its Council of Presidents and Chancellors voted unanimously Tuesday to restart the football season. The vote last month was 11-3 to postpone, with Ohio State, Iowa, and Nebraska voting against. Other fall sports remain postponed, but the Big Ten indicated that might change. The decision to play came after sharp pressure from coaches, players, parents, and even President Donald Trump, all of them pushing the Big Ten football season. The conference is home to a number of battleground states in the November election, and Mr. Trump swiftly applauded the move in a tweet. The emergence of daily rapid response COVID-19 testing, not available when university presidents and chancellors decided to pull the plug on the season, helped trigger the revote. The Big Ten said it will begin daily antigen testing of its athletes, coaches, and staff on September 30th. Team positivity rates and population positivity rate thresholds will be used to determine whether teams must halt practice or play. The earlier an athlete will be able to return to game competition would be 21 days following a COVID-19 positive diagnosis. Everyone associated with the Big Ten should be very proud of the groundbreaking steps that are now being taken to better protect the health and safety of the student athletes and surrounding communities, said Dr. Jim Borcher, team physician for Ohio State. The Big Ten will take a bow, but the conference has been battered for a month. First-year Commissioner Kevin Warren was the main target, criticized for a lack of communication within the conference and not providing enough information to back the initial decision. The Big Ten postponed its season on August 11th, indicating it would try to make up the season in the spring, but there were no plans in place. The Pac-12 followed the Big Ten in postponing, but was far more detailed in its explanation and also had more obvious hurdles to clear. Half of the Pac-12 schools are still operating under statewide restrictions that make it impossible for teams to practice. Meanwhile, as the Big Ten and Pac-12 bailed, the 3 other Power 5 conferences forged ahead, along with 3 other major college football leagues. Games have started, with the Big 12 and Atlantic Coast Conference kicking off last week. The Southeastern Conference is scheduled to start playing games September 26th. Meanwhile, the Big Ten was on the sideline, with coaches struggling to explain to players why other teams could play, but they could not. We're excited and we can't wait to get started, Michigan State linebacker Antoine Simons said. In Nebraska, 8 players have filed a lawsuit against the Big Ten over its decision to postpone. Glenn Snodgrass, father of one of the players, Garrett Snodgrass, was teaching a class at the Nebraska high school he works at when he received word of the reversal. This is what a lot of people have been fighting pretty hard for, he said. I can't say enough about those 8 boys and what they had the courage to do. They worked their entire lives to get where they are, and they just wanted to play. Nebraska was at the forefront in opposing the Big Ten's original decision. The university had put out a joint statement from the school president, athletic director, and coach Scott Frost expressing disappointment. Mr. Frost had also suggested Nebraska might look outside the Big Ten to play games. You might want to know that AP writers Larry Lage and Eric Olson contributed to this story. On next, Confessions of a Self-Talker. The trick is to be circumspect circumspect about talking to oneself in public, lest genius be mistaken for madness, by Robert Close. One of my students once expressed a personal concern to me. He said he talked to himself, and this worried him. As a self-talker in my own right, I had words of encouragement from him. People who talk to themselves are geniuses. Okay, I admit it's something I read online, but hey, there are worse things one can be called, and it did assuage my students' anxieties. As for me, I long ago made peace with talking to myself once I recognized its myriad of advantages. For one, it shores up my memory. Take shopping, for example. I found that I can save on paper and ink by memorizing my shopping list. I do this by arranging the items in some appealing manner and reciting my creation over and over from my front door to the supermarket shelves. Broccoli and eggs in sparkling water, sauteed in butter and yogurt. Yum! For two, it keeps me on track. Many a time I have left the house with the intentions, say, of dropping a letter off at the post office. I dutifully place the missive in the visor of my car and to remind myself to stop at the post office en route to my ultimate destination. I recite, the letter is in the visor, the letter is in the visor, the letter, you get the picture. Last, talking to myself helps me to problem solve. Recently, I was changing an electrical outlet, something with which I have vague familiarity, but do not do on a regular basis. The thing is, I tend to forget which is the hot wire and which is neutral, and so I repeat. Black is hot, white is neutral. Don't forget this, and don't forget to turn off the power. I'm pleased to report that the project was a success, which I attribute in part to my vocalization of all of the particulars. The trick to be a contented and productive self-talker is to be circumspect about doing it in public, lest my genius be confused with madness. I have to admit, though, that it is not as easy as turning a faucet on and off. Sometimes when I'm on the go, I do indeed become self-absorbed and commence my monologue while being part of a crowd. Whether on campus, on a bus, or in a busy store, it doesn't matter. I've often found myself saying something like, now don't forget, when you get home, pay the gas bill. It's due in 2 days. Gotta pay the gas bill. Remember that. My children grew up listening to me talk to myself. I believe this had a salutary effect on their development. No matter where they were in the house, they could hear me mumbling along, creating lists in my head, staying on tack, and working through problems and situations out loud. Now and then, one of them would call out, Dad? Yes? Oh, okay, just checking. Talking to myself then had the benefit of communicating that I was in the house and available to them. That's all they wanted to know. And so I roll and talk merrily along, convinced of the benign nature of my habit and willing to serve as guru and affirmer to those such as my student, who worry there might be something wrong with them. There's not. The beauty of self-talking is that one's words, free-flowing as they are, can lead anywhere, such as today when I announced to myself and nobody else, now where did I put my keys? I just had them in my hand. They're not in my pocket. What about the pants I just put in the hamper? Are we there yet? Well, my friends, that's the end of today's reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, September 18th. Should I stop reading or should I go on? Where's the rest of the articles? Oh, I don't see any more. So I guess I have to say, until we talk to you again, be safe, stay in, you be blessed, and do something today that will make it a great day just for you.